The wind held its breath, as if the forest itself feared to disturb the hush that had settled over the pines. Snow fell in silent, deliberate flakes, each one a whisper of winter's relentless grip, burying the world beneath a blanket so thick it muffled even the crunch of Maeve's boots. Her breath fogged the air in front of her, a ghostly plume that vanished into the gloom. Each step sank deeper into the drifts, the leather of her boots groaning against the cold, the ropes of the sled biting into her palms like a punishment she'd long since learned to ignore. Behind her, Maria moved with the quiet resilience of a child who'd never known the luxury of complaint. At 10, her face had already hardened into a mask of quiet endurance, though her eyes, sharp and watchful, betrayed a mind that missed nothing. The sled creaked under its meager load of firewood, damp bark, splintered twigs, anything that might burn without choking them on smoke. It wasn't enough to last the night, but they'd gone farther than usual, driven by necessity and the unspoken fear of returning to a hearth that had grown too accustomed to ash. Then Maria stopped, not abruptly, but with a sudden stillness that made Maeve's spine tighten. "Ma," she murmured, her voice low but steady, pointing ahead. Through the veil of falling snow, Maeve's gaze followed her daughter's finger to a dark shape slumped against a pine, half swallowed by the storm's debris. At first, it was just another shadow in a forest full of them, a stump, a boulder, a trick of the light. But then it moved, a twitch, imperceptible to anyone less attuned to survival. But to Maeve, it screamed of life clinging to the edge of oblivion. Her pulse thrummed in her throat as she approached, pulling Maria behind her with a motion so ingrained it required no thought. The man was bound to the tree, his body sagging against the ropes that bit into his chest, blood crusted at his temple like rust on steel. His lips were blue, his face pale as the snow beneath him, and yet he breathed, a shallow, uneven rhythm that seemed to defy the cold's claim on him. Whoever left him here had done so with purpose, a cruel arithmetic of abandonment. But Maeve didn't hesitate. Her fingers closed around the small knife Maria offered, its blade worn but sharp enough to sever the ropes. With swift, deliberate cuts, she freed him, his weight collapsing into her arms like a sack of stones. "We'll try," she whispered when Maria asked if they could haul him home. Though the words felt like a promise, she wasn't sure she could keep. The sled groaned under his limp form as they began the brutal trek uphill, the snow now clawing at their legs, stinging their cheeks. Maeve's muscles burned, her mind racing with questions she couldn't voice. Why would anyone leave a man to die? What kind of cruelty could silence a life so thoroughly? The forest swallowed the sound of their labored breathing, dusk bleeding into the horizon like a wound. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, a sound too sharp, too close, but Maeve didn't look back. The man's survival, and their own, depended on moving forward. The cabin's hearth flickered like a dying ember, casting long shadows that danced over the walls as Maeve knelt beside the stranger. His frozen coat clung to his body, stiff with ice and blood, its fine wool whispering of a life she couldn't fathom. She worked methodically, her fingers numb from the cold, peeling the garment away to reveal a shirt torn at the shoulder, the fabric darkened by a jagged wound. Maria hovered nearby, her small hands clutching a tin cup of broth, her eyes darting between her mother's face and the man's still form. The air smelled of damp wool, ash, and something sharper, the metallic tang of blood. Maeve's breath hitched as she pressed a cloth to his temple, the gash there crusted and deep. Whoever had left him to die had done so with precision, a calculated cruelty that made her stomach twist. But this wasn't the first time she'd seen violence etched into flesh. She'd grown used to the weight of scars, the way pain lingered in the spaces between words. Yet this felt different, personal. The nights blurred into a haze of tending and waiting. Maeve's spoon fed in broth, her patience tested by his shallow, uneven swallowing, his fevered skin alternating between burning heat and clammy chill. Maria watched every motion, how her mother adjusted the blankets, how she murmured quiet reassurances without expecting a reply, how her hands never trembled despite the exhaustion etching lines into her face. The girl learned without being told, absorbing the rhythm of care like a second language. On the third morning, the fire had dwindled to embers when his eyelids fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "Safe," Maeve said, her voice low and steady, a blade sheathed in calm. His gaze met hers, hollow but searching, as if trying to parse whether her words were truth or cruelty. Maria stepped forward with water, her small hands steady despite the tremor in his fingers as he grasped the cup. He drank in shallow sips, his throat working like each drop was a battle. No gratitude, no questions, only the raw silence of someone who'd forgotten how to speak. Maeve's mind circled the unanswered riddles. Who hunts a man this way? What kind of life carves such hollows into a face? Her fingers brushed his wrist, checking his pulse, a fragile thread of life that felt too easily severed. The fine weave of his coat, the calluses on his palms, the way his body tensed even in unconsciousness, all contradictions. A man of means, yet accustomed to labor. A survivor, though not by choice. When he finally rasped, "Name's Jasper Boone," the syllables cracked like dry leaves underfoot. Maeve didn't smile. Names were currency she'd stopped trading in long ago. Words could be lies. Actions, however, left marks. She met his gaze, her voice firm but unyielding. "Maeve?" Maria lingered at the edge of the room, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table, as if memorizing the shape of this fragile exchange. The name Jasper Boone hung in the air, unremarkable yet heavy, a threadbare cloak offering no warmth. Outside, the wind howled, but within the cabin, something unspoken took root, a tenuous tether between three souls bound by survival, their pasts bleeding into the present like ink through parchment. Days bled into one another, the rhythm of recovery slow but steady, measured in the creak of floorboards and the soft rasp of Jasper Boone's breath as he pushed through pain. His body, once a tangle of bruises and fractures, began to remember its purpose, a slow reclamation of muscle and sinew. He split wood clumsily, the axe heavier in his left hand than he cared to admit, each swing a battle against the lingering weakness in his shoulder. The logs cracked unevenly, splinters flying like shrapnel, but he persisted, sweat beading beneath his woolen cap despite the chill. The scent of pine resin clung to the air, mingling with the earthy tang of damp soil as Maeve watched from the doorway, her arms folded, her gaze tracing the way his jaw tightened with every effort. She noted the tremor in his grip when he paused, the way his breath hitched before he squared his shoulders and swung again. He was trying, not just to heal, but to reclaim something intangible, a sense of self stripped away by ropes and betrayal. Maria hovered nearby, her small hands clutching a slate board smeared with chalked equations. The numbers blurred at the edges, smudged by her sleeve, but she held her focus, brow furrowed. Jasper Boone corrected her arithmetic with a patience born of habit, his voice softening as he explained fractions. "Here," he said, tapping the slate. "You've got the numbers right, but they're shy. Pull them together." She nodded, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Maeve noted how his fingers twitched when he spoke, as though they longed for the weight of a ledger, the crisp authority of ink on paper. He was no schoolteacher, yet his mind moved in orderly rows and columns, a relic of life now buried beneath calluses and snow. The girl's laughter, when it came, was a spark in the gloom, a sound that made Maeve's chest ache with something she refused to name. Evenings brought quieter revelations. One dusk, as the sky bled into indigo, Jasper Boone carved Maria a wooden horse from a block of pine. His knife slipped more than once, leaving the legs lopsided, the mane a jagged swirl. But Maria laughed, a bright, unguarded sound, as she cradled the figure, its imperfections endearing. "You're clever," he told her, his voice rough with something that wasn't quite nostalgia. "Mama taught me," she replied, her thumb tracing the horse's uneven flank. "We had to be." The words hung between them, like a question neither could ask. What had they endured? Maeve stirred the stew, her back to the hearth, her eyes on the girl. Maria's resilience was a mirror of her mother's, forged in the same fire of necessity. Yet where Maeve's strength had calcified into armor, Maria's still shimmered with possibility, a rawness that Jasper Boone seemed to understand instinctively. Later, as shadows stretched across the cabin floor like grasping fingers, Jasper Boone turned to Maeve. "You don't ask questions," he murmured, his fingers drumming the table. She didn't look up, her ladle scraping the pot's edge with a metallic sigh. "Only the ones that matter," she replied. "Keeping my daughter safe. Keeping ruin out." Her voice was a low current, steady and unyielding. He nodded, but his gaze drifted to the window, where the horizon swallowed the last light. There was a tension in his posture, a coiled readiness, as though the past might rise from the pines at any moment. Maeve studied him. The way his eyes lingered on the rifle propped near the door, the way his shoulders hunched as if warding off a phantom chill. He was a man accustomed to carrying weight, not just in his body but in his bones. When he finally said, "I'll reclaim what's mine soon," Maeve didn't flinch. Men always left. That truth was etched into her bones. Yet when he brushed her hand goodbye, fingers lingering a heartbeat too long, a spark flickered beneath her skin. It was a dangerous warmth, the kind that threatened to thaw walls she'd built brick by brick. She pulled away first, retreating to the stove, but the imprint of his touch lingered, a phantom weight she couldn't shake. Her hands steadied on the ladle, stirring the stew in slow, deliberate circles. She hated the way her pulse betrayed her, fluttering like a moth against a flame. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying whispers of things unsaid. The trees creaked in protest, their branches clawing at the glass as Jasper Boone stood, his shadow stretching across the room like a promise or a warning. The fire popped, its embers glowing brighter as Maria blew on them, unaware of the undercurrents swirling between the adults. Somewhere in the forest, a branch snapped. Maeve's head tilted, listening, her instincts sharpened by years of solitude. She'd heard the same sound the night she found Jasper Boone tied to the tree, a sharp, unnatural break that set her nerves on edge. But the night held only silence and the faint, persistent ache of something new taking root. Jasper Boone lingered near the hearth, his boots scuffing the floorboards as he hesitated. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked, the question cutting through the quiet like a blade. Maeve didn't answer immediately. She focused on the stew, stirring until the broth swirled into a vortex. Next was a luxury she couldn't afford, a word that invited hope or heartbreak, sometimes both. Instead, she said, "This house is enough." Her voice was steel, but her hands trembled. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the sawdust clinging to his sleeves, the faint trace of blood beneath it. "It is," he said quietly, "but you deserve more than enough." The admission hung in the air, fragile and unspoken. Maria glanced up, her slate forgotten as she watched the space between them, a chasm bridged by unspoken truths. Maeve turned away, her throat tight. She hated him for seeing what she refused to name, hated herself for wanting him to stay. The fire crackled louder, drowning out the wind as Maria fed it another log. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering like ghosts of the past. Maeve wondered if Jasper Boone saw them too, the faces of those he'd lost, the life he meant to reclaim. But when she looked at him, his gaze was steady, fixed on her, as though she were the only map he needed. Outside, the world remained vast and uncertain, but here, in this room, the air felt thicker, charged with the weight of all they hadn't yet dared to claim. A moth battered itself against the window, its wings casting frantic shadows. Maeve reached for the pistol on the shelf, her fingers brushing its cool surface. Not for danger, but for the comfort of its weight, a reminder that survival was never about trust, only choice. Jasper Boone saw the gesture and nodded, as if he understood. He didn't ask why she kept it close, didn't press for answers she couldn't give. Instead, he said, "I'll be back before the frost lifts." She didn't reply. Words felt too fragile here, too easily shattered by the weight of what he left unsaid. But when Maria fell asleep that night, clutching the wooden horse to her chest, Maeve lingered by the fire, staring into the flames until her eyes burned. Jasper Boone's boots were by the door, his coat draped over a chair, small, ordinary things that anchored him to this place. She hated that, too. By dawn, the wind had stilled, but the ache in her chest remained, a quiet, relentless throb. Something new was taking root, and Maeve didn't know whether to nurture it or rip it out before it could bloom. Spring teased the land like a hesitant lover, its warmth seeping into the frost-bitten soil in uneven pulses. Ice melted into muddy trails that clung to boots and hooves, the earth exhaling a damp, loamy breath after months of stillness. Jasper Boone worked tirelessly, his hands calloused and raw as he fixed hinges that groaned from disuse, patched splintered floors, and sketched his lost ranch on a parchment spread across the kitchen table. The map bore the weight of his obsession. 800 acres etched in charcoal, the valley's curve, the creek's fork, the scarred pine marking the northern boundary. "They wanted more than my money," he muttered one evening, his finger tracing the inked lines. Maeve stood nearby, her arms folded, the firelight catching the sharp angles of her face. She didn't ask what he meant. The bruises on his ribs, the stiffness in his walk, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke, all told her enough. Men didn't kill for coin alone. They killed for power, for fear, for the thrill of silencing someone who dared to rise. The phrase "big porch," room enough for 3-inch hung between them like a promise or a taunt. Maeve stared at the map, her mind calculating the risks, the distances, the thin veil of safety they'd built. But she said nothing. Words felt too fragile here, too easily shattered by the weight of what he intended. When he rode off at dawn, the mule laden with maps, a rifle, and a satchel of dried meat, dread coiled in her chest like a serpent. He paused at the tree line, turning back once, his silhouette framed against the pale horizon. Maeve didn't wave. She didn't trust her hands to stay steady. Maria clung to her skirts, her small fingers digging into wool as they watched him vanish into the thawing wilds. Days bled into nights. The cabin grew quieter, the fire dimmer, the chores heavier. Maria's laughter faded into silence, replaced by the rhythmic tapping of her fingers on the window pane as she stared toward the ridge. Maeve moved through the days like a woman sleepwalking, her hands occupied, but her mind elsewhere, splitting wood, mending socks, sharpening knives. Each task was a ritual, a way to stave off the questions clawing at her resolve. Would he come back? Would he come back whole? By the fifth night, the wind shifted, carrying the metallic tang of rain and the low rumble of thunder. Maeve lit every lamp in the house, their flickering light a defiant glow against the encroaching dark. On the sixth evening, hoofbeats shattered the quiet, a frantic, uneven rhythm that sent Maria sprinting to the door. Maeve followed, her heart a drumbeat in her throat. Jasper Boone staggered onto the porch, his coat torn, blood darkening the shoulder of his shirt, his face gaunt but alive. He leaned against the doorframe, breath ragged, eyes locked onto hers. "It's done," he growled, the words torn from his chest. "They're gone." The rifle slipped from his grip, thudding onto the floorboards. Maeve's hands found his face, her thumbs brushing the grime and sweat from his cheekbones. Her voice was steel, but her touch was gentle. "You'll stay?" she asked, though it wasn't a question. He kissed her knuckles. Not romance, not yet, but a vow pressed into her skin, a pledge that he'd chosen this place, this life, this family. But as Maria rushed forward to hug his legs, her small arms trembling with relief, Maeve's gaze drifted to the horizon. The storm had broken, rain slashing sideways, the wind howling like a wounded thing. Somewhere beyond the ridge, shadows lingered, unseen, unspoken, but present. Jasper Boone's victory felt too clean, too final for a world that thrived on unfinished business. She didn't voice her fears. Not yet. Instead, she helped him inside, peeled away his soaked coat, and pressed a bowl of stew into his hands. They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them, Maria's head resting on Jasper Boone's shoulder as he dozed off. But later, when the girls slept and the rain softened to a drizzle, Maeve stood at the window, the pistol heavy in her lap. The land outside was a churn of mud and water, the trees bending under the wind's relentless push. She thought of the men Jasper Boone had faced, their faces, their names, their unfinished rage. "They're gone," he'd said, but Maeve knew better. Gone wasn't the same as finished. And as the first streaks of dawn crept over the hills, painting the sky in bruised hues of orange and gray, she wondered if the past had truly released them, or if it was merely waiting, patient and hungry, for its next move. 3 weeks after Jasper Boone's departure, the air around the cabin grew thick with unease. The wind carried a brittle, metallic edge, as if the forest itself had drawn its breath and refused to release it. Jasper Boone's letters, short, infrequent, but steady, ceased without warning. Maeve noticed it first in the rhythm of the days. The way Maria's laughter faltered, the way her own hands lingered on the pistol he'd left behind, its weight a hollow promise of safety. On the morning she packed the satchel, dried meat wrapped in cloth, matches tucked into a tin, the pistol holstered at her hip, she kissed Maria's brow with a resolve she didn't feel. 2 days, she murmured, though the words tasted like a lie. The mule's hooves crunched against frost as she rode east, the horizon a bruised smear of gray. The ranch greeted her with silence, so profound it seemed deliberate. The barn doors hung open like a gaping mouth, their hinges groaning in the wind. Tools lay strewn across the ground, spades half buried in mud, a leather strap coiled like a serpent near the splintered steps. A crow cawed once from the roofline, then fell quiet. Maeve dismounted slowly, her gloved fingers brushing the pistol's grip. The house stood intact, but lifeless. Its windows shuttered against the light. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of ash and old blood. The kitchen hearth bore a smear of crimson, dark and dried into the floorboards. A jagged handprint, fingers splayed as if reaching for escape. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Maeve froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man emerged from the shadows of the staircase, his silhouette lean and feral beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His coat hung loose, the fabric stained, and his hand rested on the rifle slung across his chest. "Ain't here," he sneered, voice rasping like gravel. "Maybe dead, maybe gone." Maeve's gaze didn't waver. "Wrong," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "He's alive, and he's mine to find." The man's lip curled, but before he could retort, her eyes flicked to the rug near the hearth. Its edges curled unnaturally, a patch of darker wood beneath. She moved before he could react, yanking the rug aside to reveal a trapdoor. Beneath it, Jasper Boone lay curled in the cramped crawl space, wrists raw from rope burns, his face pale and streaked with sweat. Blood seeped from a gash at his shoulder, darkening the frayed collar of his shirt. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of her breath, a ragged, uneven gasp. "Maeve," he rasped, voice fractured by thirst. "Don't speak," she ordered, her hands already sawing at the ropes with a knife from her boot. The man above shifted, boots thudding closer. "Should have finished you myself," he spat. Maeve rose, pistol leveled, her stance steady despite the tremor in her jaw. "I don't miss," she said, the words sharp as flint. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking to Jasper Boone's slumped form, then back to her unwavering aim. "You won't make a mile," he growled. "Then I'll die trying," she replied, her voice cold as winter steel. The man spat at her feet, but lowered the rifle, stepping aside with a muttered curse. Maeve didn't watch him retreat. She focused on Jasper Boone, half dragging him to his feet, his weight pressing into her shoulder as they stumbled outside. The cold bit through her coat as they moved toward the mule, its breath fogging the air in shallow bursts. Jasper Boone groaned, his head lolling against her. "3 of them," he managed, voice frayed. "Came back, thought I was alone." "You're not," she snapped, more harshly than intended, her arms tightening around him. By dusk, they were miles from the ranch, the sky choked with storm clouds. They camped beneath a cedar, its branches shielding them from the first flakes of snow. Maeve cleaned as wound by moonlight, her hands steady despite the fire in her veins. He winced once, then caught her wrist. "You're not just strong," he whispered. "You're unbreakable." She shook her head, brushing hair from his fevered brow. "No, I break. I just don't stay that way." As he slept, Maeve sat awake, pistol across her knees, eyes scanning the dark woods. The man's words echoed in her mind. Maybe dead, maybe gone, but she'd carved a truth from the marrow of her bones. Jasper Boone was neither. He was hers, and she would not let the land swallow him whole. Not this time. Not ever. The next morning, they rode toward home, the wind at their backs carrying the faint scent of spring. Yet even as the ridge came into view, Maeve knew the danger had not passed. Shadows had a way of returning, thicker and hungrier than before. But so did she. By the time they reached the cabin, Maria stood on the porch, her small frame silhouetted against the dawn. The kettle already sang on the stove. As Jasper Boone slumped onto the couch, Maeve met her daughter's gaze. "It's not over," Maria said quietly. Maeve nodded, her fingers brushing the pistol at her hip. "No, but we're still here." Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the fire burned bright, a stubborn, unyielding light in the dark. Jasper Boone healed, but the land remembered. Its scars lingered in the gnarled bark of trees, the uneven ridges of the fence posts he'd rebuilt with his own hands, the wary way the wind carried whispers of past violence. Yet life pressed forward. Men arrived, not many but enough. Quiet, scarred figures with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much to waste words on pleasantries. They worked without fanfare, their tools ringing against wood and stone as they patched the barn's splintered beams and dug the foundation for a smokehouse Maeve had long dreamed of but never dared name aloud. Maria trailed them like a shadow, her small hands eager to learn the rhythm of labor, the art of mending what time and cruelty had broken. One of the men, a half-Cheyenne scout named Soul, taught her to track, how to read the faintest indentations in mud, how to listen to the forest breath before it spoke of danger. He called her Little Flame for the way her curiosity burned relentless, and when he left a polished stone in her palm one dusk, Maeve watched from the doorway, arms folded, her heart a clenched fist softening against its will. "For luck," Soul said, his voice gravelly yet kind. Maeve didn't thank him. She placed the stone on the kitchen windowsill, where it caught sunlight like a promise. A small, unspoken admission that hope, once invited, could not be so easily dismissed. The creek became their sanctuary. On evenings when the sky bled into indigo, Jasper Boone led Maeve there, their boots crunching through frost-kissed grass. The water rushed relentless, indifferent to human wounds, its cold fingers washing over stones smoothed by centuries. One dusk, as the last light gilded the pines, he turned to her, his voice low but unyielding. "I want to marry you." The words hung between them, heavier than the silence that followed. She didn't answer, didn't trust her voice to shape the tangle of fear and longing coiled in her chest. Instead, she watched the water's relentless flow, its refusal to stagnate, its stubborn insistence on carving paths through rock. When she finally looked at him, her gaze was steady, a mirror of the creek's quiet power. "I'll stand between you and the world," he vowed, his thumb brushing the back of her hand, a gesture more vow than touch. She kissed him then, a collision of lips and breath that spoke louder than words. It was not passion that drove her. It was the terrifying clarity that this man, broken and rebuilding, had become her anchor in a world that had only ever taught her to drift. That night, while Maria slept curled around the rescued barn cat, Jasper Boone built her a shelf, not for trophies or finery, but for fragments of their shared survival. A feather shed by the hawk that circled the ridge each dawn, Maria's lopsided wooden horse carved during endless winter nights, and a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath them. Maeve found it when she woke, the ink smudged but legible in the pale light. "You are my beginning again." Her throat tightened, the words a thread stitching something fragile yet vital into place. She traced the paper's edge, her mind flashing to the day she'd cut Jasper Boone free from the tree, his blood on her hands, his breath a gamble against the cold. They had been strangers then, bound only by the cruel arithmetic of survival. Now, there was something else, something she still feared to name aloud. The land, too, seemed to soften. Roses bloomed where Jasper Boone dug trenches for their roots, their petals defiant against the memory of blood-soaked soil. Maria's laughter rang louder, her sketches of horses and birds tacked to the walls like talismans of a future no longer feared. Maeve baked pies without mention, her hands moving with the rhythm of someone who had stopped bracing for the next blow. Yet even as tenderness grew, she kept the pistol within reach, her instincts honed by years of betrayal. Trust, she knew, was not the absence of danger, but the choice to face it with hands clasped tighter. When Jasper Boone stood on the porch at dusk, his silhouette framed by firelight, and pulled her close, she let him. For the first time in years, the weight of his arm around her shoulders felt like shelter, not a chain. The creek still whispered, the wind still carried ghosts, and the horizon still held threats unseen. But in the flicker of lamplight, in the warmth of shared blankets, in the unspoken pact between two souls who had survived too much to let love slip through their fingers, they found a fragile, unbreakable thing. Empire, they learned, was not built in gold or conquest, but in the quiet acts of rebuilding, the courage to stay, and the unyielding decision to call someone mine when the world had tried to strip them of everything worth holding. Summer thunder rolled like a drumbeat of warning, its growls swallowed by the frantic hoofbeats of the rider galloping up the trail. His face was pale as ash, his horse's flanks streaked with sweat. "They're coming," he gasped, reining in hard. 3 men, armed. The words hung in the humid air, sharp as a blade. Jasper Boone stood on the porch, his rifle already in hand, the wood grain worn smooth by months of rebuilding. Maeve gripped her pistol, fingers white-knuckled but steady, her gaze flicking to Maria, who ushered the rescued barn cat into the cellar with quiet urgency. The child moved without panic, a skill honed by winter spent surviving storms of both nature and man. The attackers rode hard, their silhouettes stark against the bruised sky. Masks obscured their faces, but their intent was unmistakable: vengeance, blood, and the reclaiming of what they'd lost. Jasper Boone's jaw tightened as he stepped off the porch, boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. "This land is mine," he growled, the rifle's weight a familiar anchor in his hands. Maeve stood beside him, her stance coiled like a spring, the pistol's grip a second skin. Maria hovered in the cellar doorway, her small hands clutching the edge of the frame, eyes wide but unblinking. The first shot cracked like a whip, splitting the air before the riders even drew rein. Maeve fired first, her aim true. A man toppled mid-howl, his horse rearing as he clutched his leg, crimson blooming against the dust. Jasper Boone's bullet followed, tearing through another's shoulder with a sickening thwack, the recoil shuddering through his bones. The third attacker froze, his masked face turning from fallen comrades to the unyielding wall of the family before him. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, then turned tail, his horse spurring into the storm-charged dusk. Maria peeked out, her breath fogging in the sudden stillness. "We're safe," Maeve said, though her voice carried the tremor of someone who knew safety was a fragile thing. She pulled Maria close, the girl's trembling body pressed to her side as rain began to fall, first in fat, reluctant drops, then in sheets that washed the blood from the soil. The bodies of the fallen blurred into the mud, their masks slipping in the downpour, revealing nothing but the anonymity of death. Jasper Boone lowered his rifle, his breath ragged, the acrid scent of gunpowder clinging to his skin. He looked to Maeve, her face streaked with rain and resolve, and saw the question in her eyes. But how many more battles await? The land, soaked and steaming, seemed to echo the thought, a silent, unanswerable promise that survival was never a single victory, but 1,000 small wars fought at dawn. Above them, lightning split the sky, illuminating the porch light flickering weakly against the storm, a beacon too stubborn to die. The rain fell harder, drumming against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Maeve's boots sank into the mire as she scanned the horizon, her pistol still raised, her breath fogging the air in shallow bursts. The attackers' horses had vanished into the tempest, leaving only hoof prints pooling with rainwater. Jasper Boone's hand found her shoulder, grounding, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ridge, where shadows writhed beneath the storm's fury. Maria clung to her skirts, her cheek pressed to Maeve's hip, small fingers digging into wool. The girl's silence was louder than thunder, a child's instinctive understanding that danger was a guest who never knocked twice. Jasper Boone's jaw tightened as he reloaded the rifle, fingers numb from cold and adrenaline. The weapon's weight had once felt foreign, a relic of a life he'd tried to bury. Now, it was an extension of his will, a testament to the truth that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the resolve to meet it head-on. He glanced at Maeve, her posture rigid, her gaze unyielding. She was a storm unto herself, a woman carved from frost and fire, her strength not in defiance, but in endurance. They had built this place brick by brick, wound by wound, and no man would claim it without paying the price in blood. The wind howled, carrying the metallic tang of rain and the faint, acrid sting of spent powder. Maeve knelt beside Maria, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Go inside," she murmured, her voice low but firm. "Lock the door. Stay near the cellar." Maria nodded, her small frame vanishing into the cabin's dim interior. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment, the storm seemed to pause, a breath held between heartbeats. Jasper Boone broke the silence first. "They'll send more." His voice was gravel, roughened by smoke and certainty. Maeve didn't answer immediately. She wiped rain from her brow, her eyes scanning the trees where the attackers had disappeared. The forest loomed like a wall, its branches thrashing in the wind, its depths hiding secrets she'd stopped trying to guess. "Maybe," she said finally, her tone unreadable, "or maybe they'll learn to fear us." Lightning flashed, etching their silhouettes into the dark. a man and a woman, scarred and unbroken, standing guard over a world that had tried to erase them. The porch light flickered again, defiant against the storm, its glow pooling around their feet like a promise. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the thunder rolled on, a distant echo of battles yet to come. But here now they were still standing, and for today that was enough. Dawn broke gold, spilling liquid light over the ridge, painting the ranch in hues of honey and flame. The porch light flickered stubbornly against the fading night, a beacon that had weathered too many storms to surrender to darkness. Below it, the land hummed with life, a testament to the quiet revolution of care. Jasper Boone's roses bloomed defiantly where he dug trenches to anchor their roots, their petals blushing crimson against the earth's scars, each bloom a requiem for bloodshed and a hymn to renewal. Maria sat cross-legged on the sun-bleached porch, her charcoal sketches scattered around her, horses and birds etched with a child's unyielding faith in motion. Her fingers smudged the lines again and again, as if trying to capture the way the wind carried whispers of the past into the present, stitching time into something whole. Inside, Maeve moved through the kitchen with the rhythm of someone who had finally claimed stillness as her own. Pies baked in the oven, their crusts golden, their fillings sweet with the stubbornness of survival. She no longer announced her labor. The act of creating warmth had become second nature, a language spoken without words. They had forged an empire not with gold or conquest, but with broth-ladled nights, where fevered brows were cooled by hands that refused to let go, with shared silences that held more truth than speeches, with calloused palms clasped tight, promising that staying was an act of rebellion. When thunder rumbled in the distance, they didn't flinch. The sound no longer heralded danger but echoed the battles they'd already survived. The shots fired, the wounds stitched, the graves left unfilled for those who dared threaten their fragile sanctuary. Together, they had turned survival into artistry. Jasper Boone rebuilding fences with the precision of a man reclaiming his soul, Maeve tending fires that warmed more than flesh, Maria learning to track not just animals, but the faint trails of hope in a world that had tried to erase them. And maybe that was the real miracle, not the absence of fear, but the audacity to build anyway. To plant roses where bullets once buried themselves, to sketch joy atop splintered wood, to bake pies while the horizon trembled. They were not untouched by the past, but they were no longer its prisoners. The land, once a battleground, now bore witness to tenderness. Jasper Boone's laughter as Maria taught him the names of stars, Maeve's quiet smile when he brushed flour from her cheek, the way they all lingered at the threshold of night and day, watching sunsets bleed into the promise of dawn. Empire, they learned, was not measured in acres or wealth, but in the courage to call a place home when every shadow once whispered, "Run." And as the morning sun climbed higher, its light pooling in the cracks of their shared history, they stood together, unbroken, unyielding, alive, not because the world had spared them, but because they had chosen, fiercely and relentlessly, to choose one another.